right, nostalgia trappers, let's gather around our listening stations and maybe learn a few things. My name is David Parsons. Welcome to the program. I am ready to go if you are. Very excited to share this conversation. My guest today is Gregory Daddis. He's a professor of history at San Diego State University and a really important voice in the recent historiography of the Vietnam War. He's written 5 books about the Vietnam War. He was one of the official advisors to the Ken Burns documentary that came out in 2017. And his latest book is so perfect for Nostalgia Trap, I had to have a conversation with him about it. I think you'll understand what I'm talking about when you hear the title of this book, which is Pulp Vietnam, War and Gender in Cold War Men's Adventure Magazines. Do yourself a favor and just Google this book right now, Pulp Vietnam, and go check out the cover, and you'll know exactly what we get into in this conversation, which is this sort of insane interplay of sex and violence, masculinity, and imperialism and racism that are on the pages of these magazines. If you don't know about these magazines, we're gonna tell you all about them here, and go pick up Gregory Daddis's book, which provides the context for the whole industry, where it came from, what it is, and how it had a dramatic impact on the attitudes of men serving in Vietnam. Super disturbing stuff, and this is a really fun conversation. I hope you enjoy it. We've got lots more Nostalgia Trap stuff out there. I wanted to make you aware that Justin Rogers Cooper, our good friend and frequent co-host on this program, has started writing a regular column for subscribers on our Patreon page. So if you go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, you will find the first edition of In the Trap, a column in which Justin is writing about stuff that comes up on all our episodes and really sort of applying the Nostalgia Trap mega thesis to all sorts of things happening in our current world and in history too. So for those of you that are fans of Justin's very particular take on dialectics and on exploring history, etc., go check out that column. I'm very much looking forward to what he's writing there. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, where you can subscribe and get access to all of our other bonus stuff too, including our weekly live streams with Justin. So thanks so much to everyone who is supporting the show. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Here is me speaking with Gregory Daddis. All right, well, Gregory Daddis, thank you so much for joining me. I can't believe that you have never been on Nostalgia Trap before, because your name has come up so many times over the years for me as a researcher on the Vietnam War. So thank you for joining me. I'm really excited to speak with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. This is great.
I want to say the name of your book right away, because I think it's such you've written a number of books on the Vietnam War, but your latest book is one that I think would capture a lot of attention from the type of people who listen to this program, because we talk a lot about, we talk a lot about gender, but pop culture as well on this show.
Right.
And your latest book is called Pulp Vietnam, War and Gender in Cold War Men's Adventure Magazines. And it's got probably the coolest title and cover I've seen of books on the Vietnam War. For those that are listening, go just Google the cover of this book, because it sort of intimates the whole world that I think you're getting into in this book, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we were fortunate enough this is the original artwork from Mort Kunstler, who's still alive and was a famous pulp illustrator back in the late 50s and into the 1960s. And we were able to reach out to his family, and he gave us permission to use the artwork on the cover. And it's from one of the pulp magazines that I saw in, I think, 67, 68.
That's amazing. I wonder how the artist feels about that, because it's in part what you're doing, it seems like, is like contextualizing and situating and pretty heavily critiquing a lot of this artwork, right?
Yes, but also, I very much admire the artwork as well. It really is phenomenal. So, in critiquing the artwork, I don't think I critique the artists themselves, because there really were some powerful imagery. And I think in the sense of why these magazines were so popular, it's because of the illustrations. They just really draw you in.
And
But yeah,
again,
I did.
I'll include some images from your book because they are. I don't think a lot of Americans know about this whole genre, honestly. Maybe it was more well known in earlier eras, but
It
we've gotten
was.
into the 2020s now, and people are far away from that era. And it seems like what is this genre of adventure book and adventure magazines?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So the magazine industry really kind of takes off in the early 1900s, and many of those magazines are targeting obviously men. Esquire is probably one of the most popular that you see in the early 1900s. But when you look at magazines like Esquire, they really are looking at a middle class, upper middle class readership. And what happens with the industry during World War II, it just explodes, the magazine industry, because they have this ready-made readership that is going overseas that in many cases doesn't have anything else to do. And so coming out of World War II, you already have a ready-made market of returning veterans who are clearly affected by the war, still interested in talking about their experiences. And what these magazines do, which is different, is these adventure type magazines, is they're targeted very much to a white working class audience. In many cases, you can see from the advertisements just alone, when you compare them to magazines like Esquire or Playboy, that the target audience is absolutely a working class readership. And so what I think these do in the 50s and 60s, and they become incredibly popular. They're selling millions of copies on an annual basis. I was doing a research study with a group of scholars from, I believe, Florida, who were looking at the distribution data. And at one point in the late 1950s, according to the data from demographic modeling, 9% of the entire state of Nevada is purchasing these magazines. So, I mean, this is a really big market. And I think why they're so popular is because they do something that no other pop culture artifact venue does at that time period. And they pull together these two very different conceptions of masculinity in a way that nobody else does. And on one side, it's this heroic masculine warrior. And on the other side, it's this sexual conqueror. And those two ideas about Cold War masculinity combined in a way that you don't see in Playboy, you don't see in Popular Mechanics or Sports Illustrated, but it provides an opportunity for, I think, returning veterans to keep talking about these adventure type stories, and many of them are focused on the military. And at the same time, they get to read, exciting stories about that are very sexual in nature. Every single one of these magazines has a coming out of World War II, not surprisingly, basically a pinup in the middle of the magazine.
Yeah, I was wondering, like, what is the intersection? Because I mean, the images of the covers of these magazines are so graphic,
Right.
and have a sort of, I don't know, they have a kind of attitude where they're almost like inviting you into this world of sex and violence. And I
Yeah,
mean, it
it's
seems
almost salacious, right?
right, and it made me think about like how did this fit into the wider popular culture in America during this time? Because I'm thinking about I don't know. There's a certain vision of the 1950s in the American
Right,
imagination with like GI
right.
Joe toys and the war being a part of
And Leave It
that.
to Beaver, right?
Right,
Which is
right.
very different.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
it's a
this
great
almost seems
question.
like this seems like pornography, and it feels like I can imagine a lot of people being like, "Oh, I don't want this material around because it's
Right, right.
disturbing."
And yet I've talked to a number of veterans already who say, Vietnam veterans that say, I would go to the barbershop with my dad on the weekends, and I was always see these magazines. And
Oh, the barber shop.
yeah,
That's
that's
where you
right.
find it.
That's right. Where young boys turn into men at the barbershop, right?
Yeah.
But it really is a good question about how these relate to larger Cold War culture. And my argument is that I think they're pretty in line, that these are not kind of outside of the mainstream, that these are very much magazines that are speaking to how American men in the Cold War era are thinking about themselves. And I think read a different way, instead of the heroic warrior and the sexual conqueror, if you kind of can read against the grain a little bit, I think what these magazines are doing are exposing some very deep-seated anxieties in the Cold War era about manhood in the post-World War II years. And this is where we see, like in the late 1800s during the Teddy Roosevelt years, a lot of public discussion about the challenges to American manhood. A lot of this, I think, does come from World War II, where you see many women serving in the armed forces for the first time. You see concerns about young men being virile and strong enough to compete against the global threat of communism. You're worried about loosening of social and cultural mores and sexual mores in the post-World War II era. And so, I think anytime you see in US history a lot of social and cultural change happening very rapidly, and I think you saw that in World War II and certainly in the 1950s, there's this kind of larger conservative, not backlash, but a hope at a correction at this. And I think that's what you see here in these magazines is, they're an antidote to all these anxieties that are bubbling up from the post-World War II years.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, he just came up on an episode here a couple days ago about just environmentalism and his conception of conservation and it tied to masculinity and tied to the ideas that you're talking about in your book, which is sort of like the conquering of nature in some way or another, right?
Right.
That being an important element of like being a man, and that being something that might rescue this. I mean, I think Roosevelt was talking about like cosmopolitan men, who were becoming like lawyers and bureaucrats, and they were losing contact with the axe swinging people who created this country. I mean, LBJ, I just read this, and you've probably heard this quote, but LBJ using the phrase "the rifle and the axe," he talks about how this country was built by men with a rifle and an axe, and the violence and the construction all happening at once. It's like there's a real through line there. It's pretty frightening.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at what's popular in 1950 culture at the time, you see a lot of books written about organization men, these suburban class men that are moving out of cities and into suburban life. Revolutionary Road is a popular novel at the time. The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit is a popular novel that becomes a book or a movie with Gregory Peck. And so there's a lot of popular discussion at the time, and you see it in these magazines of suburbia feminizing men. And the problem here is that if you're now in this global Cold War against communism, that feminization that's caused by suburbia and men no longer being out, on the frontier with axes is going to put us in a bad spot and potentially lead to the collapse of the nation against the evil communists.
You mentioned, I mean, that's intense stuff. And you mentioned John Wayne in your book, who's a figure who comes up a lot when people are talking about the Vietnam War, because he's such a sort of foil to the counterculture and everything, the direction of the culture in a different way. But John Wayne, John Wayne's movies are not like Pulp, are not like the images that you share in Pulp Vietnam. And can you talk a little bit about the difference? Because it seems like John Wayne is presenting a more, I don't know, it's not as raw, it's not as graphic, it's not as violent as these magazines.
No, absolutely not. It's definitely a sanitized version.
Right.
If you look at the end of Sands of Iwo Jima, right? I hope I'm not spoiling this for anybody, right? But when John Wayne actually dies, right, it's still very much a clean death, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's important for us to note that in many of John Wayne's films, he's fairly or pretty much an asexual figure, right? There is no combination of sex and this heroic image of John Wayne.
I mean, I'm not a John Wayne expert, but I don't think of him as a romantic leading man at all.
No, there's a couple of films out there, right? But I think when you look at his kind of war films and westerns, right, he's that tough, asexual, hero, and that's very different from the magazines, right? Because the construction of the hero in men's adventure magazines is that you go off to war, you demonstrate your courage and valor and thus your masculinity. And then either overseas or when you come home, you're rewarded sexually for those exploits. So there's kind of an equation that happens in the magazines, and they're fairly standard, in large part because the writers are just churning out article after article out on a monthly basis. Much like comics during the Cold War, you've kind of got these bullpen of writers, and so they stick to a very formulaic style. And in many cases, I think how you depict American manhood in the Cold War era is, or at least from a militarized standpoint, is heroes go validate themselves in battle and then are rewarded sexually.
Who is making these? In other words, when you look at this, I'm thinking, oh, is this government propaganda? No, I don't think it is. But at the same time,
it's not that the government is all for it, right? There's plenty of magazines that showcase how they're allowing these pulp writers and photographers to come on base and do a story on basic training. So it's not government sponsored. But it's absolutely supportive of the U.S. military in the Cold War. This is very much a patriotic venue, and there are energetic supporters and promoters of the armed forces. Like I said, there's and this is why I think there's really two audiences at play here. There's these veterans that are returning back from World War II, but it's also targeting teens and young boys. And one article in particular, I recall, this photographer and writer are going to Fort Dix, a basic training site for the U.S. Army. And basically the story is, come along with us as we tell you what basic training is like. And at the end of it's all about how the U.S. Armed Forces is helping turn these young boys into men. And while it's hard, it's all worthwhile, and you too should join the military, because this is a way to support national security and at the same time build yourself into a strong American man.
Right. I guess I was sort of thinking about the politics of that's in these magazines. They're not connected to any particular political organization, right? They're basically magazines that are running on their own. I mean, I'm thinking about like behind me, because I did all this research on underground newspapers that were produced during the Vietnam War, and it's like thinking a lot about there are official military magazines as well, and official military publications, and and then this whole sort of industry outside. And I just wonder how other artists are conceiving of that, how the military is looking at that stuff, because it seems like they're gonna support the types of magazines and publications that are in line with the American military, and roughly, but at the same time, it seems like it's maybe a place of concern at some point.
I think the magazines, as far as I could tell, outwardly tried to stay apolitical and nonpartisan, but clearly, as you're this strong supporter of a militarized American foreign policy, you're kind of showing your hand a little bit. And then as we get to the latter years of the Vietnam War, the magazines really start to unload on anti-war activists, and
so
here
these
you
magazines
really
are
see
still running during the Vietnam War.
Absolutely, yeah. It's not until the late 60s and early 70s that they really start to fall out of favor. But I was looking at source material from at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and the PX, the post exchange data, and these magazines are 12, 13 of the top 20 selling magazines in the PX system in 1968, 1969 are still men's adventure magazines.
That's so important, and I wish I had known that when I was writing my book, because I'm talking about what are GIs reading? What are
and they're still reading these,
right? And
they're
it seems
still
like
reading these.
I mean, it sounds like they're reading those adventure magazines at a rate much more than they're reading underground radical newspapers.
Yeah, absolutely, I think so. And not surprisingly, the number one magazine that's being sold at the PX is Playboy. There are officers that are concerned about this and the moral implications of this on young American men. But I think it makes sense in a way, right? That if you are drafted, and you're reading these magazines, which are basically telling you that as you've been drafted, you're showing how you are better than these weak, feminine young men who are back home protesting against the war. And oh, by the way, you can read a few stories that talk about going to Rio de Janeiro and the sex market there, or going down to Mexico and having your own adventure sexually with with women overseas. Then it makes sense to me that these would be popular for those that are serving in Vietnam, because it basically is patting them on the back and telling them that they're much more manly than the kids back home who are protesting against the war.
And they grew up with it too, it sounds like.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
it sounds like, I mean, can you talk a little bit about the kind of culture in the 50s that this is a part of? Because it seems like it's I see Mad Magazine when I look at this stuff. I see, like, I feel like there's a boys culture in the 50s,
Yeah,
and these
absolutely.
magazines are part of a wider thing. And Mad Magazine, they're doing something a little bit different in terms of taking on the culture, but it almost has a similar aesthetic, even, this kind of
It,
over the
it
top artwork.
It absolutely does, and I think they're all within the same larger orbit, right? That
Right.
American comics in the Cold War. I'm actually teaching a course this coming fall on Cold War comics. Mad Magazine, from Gaines, who is also starts in comics and then makes the transition over to Mad Magazine, and then Pulp writers. They're all within this kind of New York City orbit, and when you look at, especially after 1954, when the Comics Code Authority takes hold, you see, at least in the comics, a lot less pushback against U.S. policy, and so you see some similarities here.
What is
In terms
for
of
those that don't know, what is the Comics Code Authority in 1954? Because I know there was
yeah,
controversy in the 50s over
there's a
the
lot of
influence of
controversy.
comic books. Yeah.
That's exactly it, right? There's concerns in the early 1950s about rising rates of juvenile delinquency after World War II. There are folks, particularly one gentleman, Frederick Wortham, who writes a book called Seduction of the Innocent, who is claiming that Cold War, American comics are contributing to juvenile delinquency because there's a lot of stories and comics on crime and horror, a lot of sexualization in comics at the time. At least that was the argument. And so there's a number of Senate hearings on juvenile delinquency, and the comics get pulled into this. And ultimately, the big comic publishers, DC, what will become Marvel, basically decide among themselves to create an internal comic code authority that will set guidelines on what's appropriate and what's not appropriate.
This sounds like
So
exactly
they
what happened
self-censor them.
Yeah, it sounds like what happened in Hollywood in the
Yeah,
20s and
exactly.
30s, and they were still working in the code at that
That's right.
moment. And a lot of people don't understand that wasn't exactly state censorship; it was actually the industry itself creating their own sort of forms of censorship.
Yeah, to avoid the state censorship. That's
right.
Correct. And so, here is where I think you see these similarities to the pulp magazines. They're not questioning larger ideas about containing communism. They're not questioning a sense of a persistent state of war, or the need for a larger and more money-grabbing national security state.
Right.
They believe that the nation still needs to be mobilized for war. And so again, they're these really big promoters and supporters of the armed forces. And the stories are very clearly oversimplified. These are all stories, like the comics, that reduce the narrative down to good versus evil.
Yeah.
The villains are very easy to understand in the pulp magazines, just like they are in the comics. Most of the villains in the pulps are, retired Nazis that are somehow still living in, wherever across the globe.
Yep.
And then, consistently, as you move into the late 1950s, more and more you see villains are the easily understood evil, godless communists. And so, all of that, I think, is part of reflective of the larger culture. And that's why I don't think that these magazines are really separate offshoots to something that you're seeing within the larger Cold War American culture. I think they fit right in with, as we mentioned earlier, these anxieties about men measuring up in the Cold War era. They're right in line with many assumptions of the Cold War. And again, this is almost a how-to manual, if you think about it, right? Of how you can become a man and stay strong.
Well, it seems like the raw feed of the Cold War in some weird way. Like looking at these magazines, feels like this is, here's a delivery system that's meant for veterans, it's meant for young boys. So we've sort of like amped up the violence, we've amped up the sexuality. Right. You almost feel like you can see the ideology even more clearly when you look at these. That's what's so fascinating about them to me. Like I look at them like, Jesus, that's almost all the unsaid stuff about what the Cold War is really about.
This is your inside voice coming out, right?
Right.
But to me,
or subconscious,
It does make sense though, and what I tried to do in the book was to keep coming back to this Cold War context. So when you look at the Korean War as an example, which I think increasingly is being seen by historians who before American society has called this war the forgotten war, I think increasingly many Cold War historians are seeing how important the Korean War was, because it seems to verify that we really were fighting a global war against some monolithic form of communism, and the war in Korea seemed to prove that. And so when you see stories of American prisoners of war in Korea, or you see a stalemate rather than a clear unconditional surrender of our enemies in Korea, there are incredible anxieties. And so these magazines are also part of that to hopefully guide young boys along the right path, so they'll have, as one magazine said, the requisite balls of men who are capable of defending the nation. And so these are absolutely in line with that kind of argumentation that you're hearing among many policymakers.
I want to hear a little bit about the sort of wider story. I know that Beth Bailey is a voice who is a professor and writer who was instrumental in helping me conceive of a lot of ideas for my book, and she's
phenomenal.
Yeah, she's got a book coming out. It might be out now. I want to get her and maybe a couple of other of the editors on this program, because they're talking about. They've written a big volume about gender and masculinity and the military, U.S. military, which is changed
managing
a lot.
Sex in the U.S. military.
Say that again.
It's managing sex in the U.S. military.
Yeah, managing sex in the U.S. military, which to me is like a long time coming. We've needed to have this conversation for a while, but I was just thinking about I don't know, your own experience in the U.S. military, and sort of like, I don't know, I was raised by a father who was in the U.S. Marines and who showed us Full Metal Jacket a lot when we were young.
Right.
And so, and he was kind of like, this is how it was, because my dad went through boot camp in the 60s. And he was like, he's always like, this is how it was. And part of what he wants to communicate to us, I think what he wanted to communicate to us as young boys, because I have two brothers, was sort of like, this is sort of the attitude that was present here, for better or worse.
And I remember watching that film before going to West Point and not even understanding that it was an anti-war film. And it's very much an anti-war film.
What do you mean by that? Like, you watch it as like, this is awesome, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. That fits within the larger, mid 80s motif of Rambo films and Chuck Norris missing in action films. And the first time I watched it, I saw it as a glorification of men at war.
Isn't that incredible?
It's clearly not. Yeah, it's clearly not that, right?
Because part of me watched that and was just like, this is. I think as a young person, I was absolutely terrified to be in that position where a guy is yelling at me and emasculating me, and like pointing out how I don't measure up as a boy or a man. Was that on your mind when you were thinking about joining the military, in terms of the larger sort of, because it feels like, later in your life as you become an academic and like you are sort of turning over a lot of the ideas that are present strongly in the American military. I guess I'm just curious how that all fits together for you.
I think, to be completely honest, I'm sure as I was, going to high school in the early to mid 80s and then went to West Point. I got there in 1985. So it's only 5 years after the first women are graduating from the service academies.
Wow.
Trying not to put my present day ideas on my former 18-year-old self. I don't think I thought about it at all.
Yeah.
I just don't think I even considered the implications of being with women. I still recall many of the older cadets that were there, still being very sexist and probably even misogynistic against women. That was still present when I was there, but it never really resonated with me. It wasn't until I was much older that I started thinking about some of the organizational culture issues that the U.S. Army was having when it came to gender.
Well, Don't Ask, Don't Tell happened in what, the early 90s or mid?
Yeah. So that happens as well. So the entire time in my career, I go from Don't Ask, Don't Tell to the repeal in September of 2011. And I was teaching at West Point when the repeal was enacted. And, it really was the genesis of this book. I was teaching at West Point. A colleague of mine, Jen Kiesling, who's just a phenomenal civilian professor at West Point, and I had been talking for years about co-teaching a war and gender course. We put this course together, and in large part because Don't Ask, Don't Tell was on the cusp of being repealed, and we thought it would be important to have a course on this.
A course on war and gender at West Point.
At West Point, right? Yeah. And what was interesting was there was, to the lead up to the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, there was all these focus groups and command issues about what are we going to do in terms of, how are cadets going to room with each other and be in the same shower. And I mean, it got almost ludicrous.
It sounds like the conversations that people are having now about transgender people in bathrooms. I mean, there's a kind of like negotiation of how we manage gender. Yeah.
And there was so much concern that the Corps was just going to somehow implode, right? And when the repeal was enacted, there was this large, among the Corps cadets, this large kind of shoulder shrug. Nobody cared. Like none of the cadets cared. And it was interesting when Jen and I were teaching this course. We had a cadet who had served in Afghanistan as an enlisted soldier, was a medic. And as he was kind of talking and explaining something that he had read, he said, well, as a young gay man growing up, and he just kind of kept talking. And Jen and I, after class, talked to each other and said, this was so important about the repeal, because if he had said that, only months prior, we would have had to actually take action against him because he had said something publicly. Yeah, it was insane, right?
Yeah. But to me, it's like part of, it makes sense to me in terms of the longer arc of what we're talking about here, is that this is an institution that's very much invested in a certain kind of set of attitudes about gender, to say the least.
Absolutely. I had a young cadet who, when discussions were first occurring about doing away with the combat exclusion for women to serve in combat arms like infantry and armor, his biggest concern, because he'd come from a military family, had little to do with whether women could serve in the infantry or should serve in the infantry. His biggest concern was that he was no longer going to be able to be called an infantryman. That's what he was worried about.
Wow.
That if women were going to join the infantry, did that mean I could no longer be called an infantryman? And so these ideas and words really are important, I think. And
it seems like, I wonder if you would agree with this, but it seems like the military has served, for a long, long time. And this predates the United States, right? The military warrior culture, it's tied up with masculinity in really important ways. And it seems like violence and to a degree sexuality as well is a way to sort of like express manhood in some ways. I wonder how much. Yeah, there's a lot of anxiety now, I feel like, about the fact that there's no draft, that most American men don't have any military service or contact with it. Do you feel like the military has sort of dropped off as a central site of defining masculinity, or no?
I don't think so. I think young men, this is a huge generalization, but I still think at least some young men still find meaning in these images
Mm.
and structures of male superiority that are built into the concept of our American military history. And the reason I say this is if you look at organizations like the Proud Boys, they're donning themselves in military uniform. I call it military cosplay. But as they're expressing their own anxieties about gender and male superiority and masculinity, they're
Race, it
doing
seems like
so.
too. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
They're dressing themselves in military style uniforms, and
The
so I think
the
that
Boogaloo Boys. I mean,
right,
there's a
right,
lot
right,
of
right.
groups like this. Yeah, you're right.
So I my sense is when you look at these types of groups, they're not joining the military, but they're joining organizations that are kind of returning back to these ideas that you see in the men's adventure magazines, where the military will um, offer you a path to manhood, but then just by being associated with it, it continues to prove your manhood.
Mm.
Um,
So when you were joining West Point, were you were not thinking about this stuff at all? What were you thinking about? What was it? What was your sort of idea in joining the military? Because I mean, there are so many points of entry, and there are so many reasons why people, men and women, join the
yeah,
U.S. military. But what were you thinking at 18 years old?
money. That's what it was. I grew up in a fairly middle class family in New Jersey, and I was doing well in high school. But my dad, at some point in my junior year of high school, said, "We just need to be upfront with each other, and the best we can do, the best I can do to help you go to college is a state school in New Jersey." And there were good schools. I mean, Rutgers was a good school, and I think it's gotten much better since. Um, but it was from we were having these conversations about what we could pay for as a family,
Mm-hmm.
and it was limited basically to in-state rates in New Jersey. And so when I had as a junior a West Point cadet come visit our high school, it kind of it was the first time it became part of the conversation for us. My dad had served very briefly in the Air Force for 3 years back in the early 60s, so we didn't have a lot of family history in the military. So for me, the incentive was to get the best education I could at a price point that made sense, because going to the service academies was free.
At what point? I always wonder about this because I was working with the New York Historical Society on their Vietnam exhibition
Right.
for years. I mean, I think we were doing research for that for almost 5 years, honestly. And at the same
Mhm.
time, I think you were working on the Ken Burns,
That's right.
and we can talk about that and the idea of like sort of creating a narrative about the Vietnam War with all these other scholars. But I got to
Right.
meet a lot of scholars that I hadn't met before, including scholars from the military. And from places like West Point, and people who had been in the military or had come from the military or had done research for the state, etc. And it was a totally different experience. And I wonder, and it opened my mind completely because I was like,
Yeah.
you get sort of, I think scholars can get into their little clique and really not understand that there's a whole other world. But I wonder, at what point are you sort of thinking, oh, I'm going to become an academic, or I'm going to write, and I'm going to move that way?
I think early on, I always had an inkling that I was interested in it. And, for me, going to West Point in the mid 80s, I was there at a time when the US Army was still very much struggling with its experiences in Vietnam. I had instructors at West Point who were Vietnam veterans. When I went to Desert Storm as a young second lieutenant, we still had members of our scout platoon that were Vietnam veterans.
Wow,
Yeah,
unbelievable. Yeah.
there wasn't many of them around, but they were there.
1990
And
and 91 wasn't that long after
yeah, right.
1975. Yeah.
Right, right. And
Yeah.
so we still had a few scouts that were in my platoon. And so, for me, I think that's probably where it first started. This interest in Vietnam is I was watching my own organization, not just at West Point, but the Army as a whole, try to come to some sense of consensus over what happened
Mm.
and what were the proper lessons to be learned, and how should we be dealing with what many, by the time we got to the 1980s, were considering America's first lost war.
Yeah.
And
What were those conversations happening like in the military? Because it seems like, I mean, the in my imagination, a lot of it is still a lot of bitterness at the anti-war movement in the media and things like that. But there's also, I know that the military has done a lot more than just react. And then
Yeah,
you
there
and
was.
yeah.
I'm sure we had. I know I came into contact with folks that were still bitter about their experiences, but especially at West Point, I just came into contact with a group of really thoughtful officers and academics who wanted to seriously confront what happened and put it into some larger context, and not just write a history or teach a history of the Vietnam War, which centered around this idea of a search for blame. And what I saw in, as I increasingly got into the literature as a scholar, is that much of the literature, American centric, on Vietnam is this search for blame. I'm blaming the media. I'm blaming the anti-war movement. I'm blaming bad strategy or blaming bad generals. I'm blaming Jane Fonda. It just goes on and on and on. And, I think the good thing about our field right now is that it's increasingly moving away from that, especially as it's incorporating more and more Vietnamese voices into the narrative, which is so important. And I think the biggest and best trend in our field right now, my field right now, is that you've got really serious scholars that are trying to pull us out of the American-centric approach and really consider the larger context, and especially the Vietnamese context.
Yeah, and I think that has only increased as time has gone on. I feel like that was the best thing happening when I was in graduate school, and it was part of, especially in California, but other places too, the fact that there are so many Vietnamese people who came
Right.
to the United States, and there's that diaspora is now generational, and you have
Absolutely.
people that are like, raised in the United States, but their parents had this experience, and they're telling stories and becoming academics themselves, etc.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense.
And I've taught a war myth and memory course, and one of the books I chose was about intergenerational trauma and how trauma from war is passed down through families. And I think that's incredibly important. If you read a wonderful book by Ocean Vuong, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, he really talks about this trauma being passed down from mother to child as these fathers and mothers are escaping from war, coming to America and then trying to reinvent themselves, but at the same time carrying with them these deep scars from war.
God, thinking about that experience, like those are the voices I want to hear now, and things of like people that were that are coming of age in the 1970s and 80s in the United States, surrounded by this cultural and political conversation about what the Vietnam War meant to America. What you're a Vietnamese person who's now in the United States witnessing this. It's God,
what Vietnam did to Americans. I think, not surprisingly, we have I think coming out of the war, a very selfish perspective, right? It's the memoirs, the novels, it's what Vietnam did to us.
Right.
Without thinking, what did we do to Vietnam?
Yeah. Even Platoon, movies like that. Right. Those are great movies.
Taxi Driver, The Deer Hunter. It's all about how Vietnam broke good Americans and turned them into something.
Yeah. And even when in like a movie like Platoon, I feel like was, because I watched that when I was way too young, and it depicts atrocities of American soldiers, and to me, like I felt that deeply. I feel like Oliver Stone really wanted to communicate that as well, but it was still like the position of those victims is one that in which you're sort of reflecting on how abusing them hurt Charlie Sheen or hurt the Americans. Yeah.
And you see that in the Pulp magazines as well, especially as they're depicting Vietnamese women, that, and this is the problem of how these magazines are depicting not just Vietnamese women, but I think women more generally, that they're at once sexually desirable and at once incredibly dangerous. And so, this is the very definition, I think, of misogyny, which is that you're desiring something that you detest. And
it's dark territory, man. It's been, I think this is the week where it's the 50-year anniversary of the My Lai massacre. I haven't taught the My Lai massacre in detail in a while, but I used to like bring this material to undergrads, and we would read the investigations, and it feels like what happened at My Lai, I know, was not anomalous to the Vietnam War at all, but at the same time, the sort of like savagery and abuse of civilians and rape of women, etc., seems in line with the adventure magazines that you're describing. Like it's almost like
Yeah,
that scene was created at Mili.
I think so, but I was also very careful though of how I depicted this, right? Because I don't think that if you read the magazines
Right.
and embraced what they were saying, that you then went to um, Vietnam and committed sexual violence.
Like it's
I
not
don't
a
think
one
there's
to one. Yeah.
no, not at all, not at all. But I think what these magazines did for young readers is it opened up certain spaces for them to think about what was normal and even acceptable,
Yeah.
right? So if they did see women, they could look at them as opportunities for sex, for proving their manhood, and perhaps even demonstrating their own power. And if they did see sexual violence or rape, the magazines told them that that was normal, even if it was detestable, right? And
Mm.
so, that was how I got a sense of what the magazines were telling, that
It's kind of like
rape
war is
was
hell. Like that.
exactly
Yeah.
right. Rape is a normal part of war,
Ugh.
and so when I think when Americans saw it in action and some participated in it, it was just deemed to be normal,
Hmm.
which is clearly problematic, right?
Well, I
And
mean,
this is why I
yeah.
think too that we need to really think deeply about just blaming the military culture or basic training for what it did to these young draftees. I think you have to look at these cultural inputs about how young men and increasingly women now are thinking about war and what's acceptable as we conduct war in and among local populations overseas.
I wonder what you think about that in terms of God. I'm thinking about coming out of My Lai. You know, there was a lot of blame put on like William Cali and one guy,
Right.
and there was this real desire to sort of make this an anomalous, evil thing that had come out of this very particular military moment and very particular set of people. But it seems like what you're
Or what the
describing,
war did to him, right? That
right, right.
Cali was a good guy and he was just doing his duty, and look what the war did to him.
Right, and what you're
Um,
describing is a much larger sort of and a much larger sort of culture that comes out of the Cold War, but is even, I mean, extended beyond
yeah,
that. Yeah.
I understand the argument of when you go through basic training, we're going to break you down and rebuild you as a soldier or Marine. Um, and I understand the attraction to that argument, especially if you're a drill instructor. But I think we need to be um, accept the proposition, right, that gender norms and values are imparted to servicemen long before they join, and they probably still stay with them. In many cases during the Cold War, I think these norms were reinforced in the military rather than breaking down and rebuilding in a different way. Um, and so I think when you look at Cali and read some of his transcripts um, from the trial, and I actually have him in the book as well. He's still talking in very gendered language about killing young women and why he's doing it, and looking at women as vessels for creating more communists, right? That if I kill a woman, that means that she can't birth more commies.
Wow.
And that's that language. You could see that language being replicated in the men's adventure magazines. And again, I'm not talking about a causal relationship here, but there were parallels that I thought were really interesting. That's why I wanted to go into the war crime working group files when I was doing research for this book and look at the language. And in many instances, the language paralleled what you saw in the magazines. And so I think what that did for me is reinforce this idea that we really need to look at culture and even popular culture as how it contributes to what our soldiers see as acceptable once they get into a wartime environment.
That pop culture, comes up so much in our imagination of the Vietnam War. That's what's interesting, right? Is that like I don't know, movies like Forrest Gump, I mean Platoon, we've named a lot of
Right.
them. It's sort of like these movies want to always sort of give you some shorthand of what pop
Right.
culture was like, and that pop culture was important in one way or another. So it feels like
It
you
still
know,
informs, right?
yeah,
I mean,
for television war.
how many Americans know the most about World War II, as an example, by watching Save It Private Ryan,
Yeah.
or know the most about World War One by watching Dunkirk, or World War II by watching Dunkirk, or World War One by watching 1917. So, yeah, I think in many ways, and movies in particular, are still a venue for how we understand war as Americans, because
Is war?
not a lot of Americans are reading military histories from. And I think as military historians, we need to do better at that, of kind of opening up our gaze a little bit and writing for a different type of audience, so folks aren't just getting their understanding of war through movies.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's important, but it feels like, I mean, I teach I teach these classes out at the base at Point Magoo here. They're like college extension classes that are all veterans and active duty service members. And yeah, the attitude for many of them is not an attitude that we're describing here, of like, deep ideological connection to anything. I mean, a lot of them they just feel like working class people who are working a job. And that's,
Yeah,
that's part of it.
and I think we need to appreciate that. I know for me, many times when I was serving in the Army, especially as a junior officer, I was just too busy to be thinking about larger, issues of cultural norms. And, I was just busy doing day-to-day tasks on which the Army runs. And, so sometimes I think we need to be careful of just dismissing that, because I think you're exactly right. In many ways, young soldiers and NCOs and officers, they're just so busy doing their jobs to stay up on a day-to-day basis with these very packed training schedules, that sometimes we forget that it's okay that they're not trying to put things into a larger global context, whether it's political or cultural.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of what these magazines, the adventure magazines that you write about, are very cartoonish. They seem like as much as they are connected so deeply to ideology and even the practices of the U.S. military, at the same time they're presenting this really over the top, graphic depiction that seems in a lot of ways totally out of step with the war experience in some ways.
Yeah, the magazines, as I argue, are kind of in tension with themselves, right? That you have a lot of articles that are written by veterans, and so they're trying as best as possible to share their stories, and in many cases, even those, I would argue, are a sanitized version of reality. But when you get folks that aren't actually veterans who are writing, again, a lot of these pulp writers are writing multiple articles on a weekly basis, and are doing their best to tell a good story. And sometimes that just doesn't match the reality of war.
Well, there's a lot of exaggeration, it seems like.
Yeah, absolutely. You're trying to sell a product,
right?
That's what they were doing, and
how do you?
So it makes sense to me.
I wanted to talk about the Ken Burns film, in part because the idea of creating this story, was really difficult for us at the museum to try to create. And in the same way that I'm imagining people in the U.S. military in the mid '80s are struggling to kind of create a coherent narrative out of a lot of different contradictory pieces, I guess.
That's right.
Yeah, and I mean, what was it like when you were working on the Burns film, trying to conceive of that in the 21st century? Because it seems like, was the intention to create a sort of story that made sense in a way that's sort of getting past a lot of the contradictions that have maybe, I don't know, distorted our vision of what Vietnam was in the past?
I don't think so. I think my sense is that Ken and Lynn Novak and Jeff Ward, who was the principal writer, really leaned into the contradictions. And what I was so impressed with all of them is that they knew they were stepping into some rough going ahead, and they knew there was going to be criticism. And at one point during one of the meetings, I think Lynn or Ken, I can't remember which, said, look, if we're getting it from both sides, that means we've hit it about right.
Yeah,
and they were so committed to getting as many of these nuances in as possible.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge, I think, for them, I think the total was 18 hours, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
And they said even 18 hours, which by their standards was a really long documentary, was still too short. And, for me, I think what was most impressive, and I've used the class to teach with my students, is if you look at the byline of the documentary, to me, that's the message that it sends. And there is no single truth in war.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I use that with my students to tell them about the complexity of history and the nuances. And a young American soldier from Chicago is going to have a very different truth to the war than a Vietnamese civilian whose hamlet has been bombed, or a National Liberation Front fighter who genuinely believes that the communism makes sense for this community,
mm-hmm.
or a senior U.S. policymaker who genuinely is concerned about Cold War conflict and believes that American credibility was at stake. That there are all these multiple truths, and they could exist simultaneously, and all of them be correct.
Yeah.
Even as they're in contradiction with one another. And
isn't that a frustrating thing to try to communicate?
It is. And I think that was, I think Ken and Lynn knew that was the challenge. I still think that, everybody has their opinion on the documentary. I still think they did a pretty phenomenal job of getting in as many voices as they could.
I can't stop thinking about some of the things that are in that film, honestly. Yeah. And I know we talked about it with Christian Appy on this show, and when we definitely had critical things to say about it. And I've actually been in rooms where it's a voice that you may know, Bill Earhart.
Yeah.
And he's an anti-war dude and poet, and I love Bill, and I've had the chance to meet him a couple times over the years. But there was a conference at Notre Dame a few years ago that was about it was all scholars of anti-war GIs and the anti-war movement in the American military.
Right.
And I remember Bill standing up, because he's the guy that does not shy away from saying, and he has he's in the film, he's in the Ken Burns film, has actually one of the more memorable moments, but he was so mad about it. He was so mad about the movie, and he was just like, this is just the worst, this is an abomination, etc. And I was like sitting next near him and thinking, I thought it was all right. But it's amazing how much it's
a challenge. Even
broad it is.
And even something as simple as where you start and how you start to tell the story. They were concerned in some of the initial meetings that if they spent too much time on the French Indochina War, they were going to lose American viewers who weren't interested in what the French were doing.
Yeah.
And so, I think as filmmakers and documentarians, they were faced with some peculiar challenges, and it's always easy, I think, to even if you're in it and being interviewed for it as a participant, it's a lot easier to kind of Monday morning quarterback and tell them where they could have done different or should have done different.
It's also, and this as well, the people who lived through that era, whether they be Vietnamese people or American people who were involved in the anti-war movement, they all have decades now of experience in thinking about and talking about this stuff, but they also, many of them have a narrative that is.
That's exactly right. And that's why I'm very careful as a historian of placing too much value on oral history, in large part because my concern as a historian is, especially in the aftermath of the global war on terror, is I wonder how much our experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan have shaped the memories of those who served in Vietnam. And
what do you mean by that? That's a really intriguing idea there.
So I think that memory is fragile. I think memory can change over time. I think you can remember things differently over time. And I wonder how much of how the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan unfolded. There was always this narrative in the background of comparing it to Vietnam.
Yes.
So Iraq starts to stalemate, and
the quagmire word.
We start to see quagmire come up, We saw just recently the withdrawal from Afghanistan and it being compared to helicopters leaving, the final American helicopters leaving South Vietnam. And so I'm just concerned that these kind of contemporary events just push and mold and shape veterans' memories over, in many instances, especially for those who saw combat, arguably the most chaotic periods of their lives.
Yeah.
And, I think to just be able to describe something as chaotic as war, to then try and figure out what your memory is like 40 to 50 years later, after the United States has been in, a decades-long war, I think we just need to be careful with that. And that was the challenge, I think, for Ken and Lynn during the documentary, is that they decided not to have historians, which I think was probably a good idea. Mm-hmm. That they weren't going to have talking heads; they were just going to have participants, which I think
I agree.
was a good idea. Great. But it was still, problematic in the sense of, I remember one Marine who had served and was talking about what was going on in the Johnson White House. Well, you need to be careful of that, right? That you weren't in the Johnson White House. That's right. Yeah. And so I think that's part of the challenge with this, is that, we need to be careful about how we ask participants about history and to get them to focus on their own history rather than speaking about, this is what Johnson was doing in the White House. Well,
I think that's a really great point. And, I've spoken to on this show and in research too, to mostly people from the left and the anti-war movement who have their own sort of mythologies, about what the Vietnam War was, what they did, what the meaning of what they did, and believe me, it comes with its own. I don't want to use a military analogy, but it's a minefield. It really is.
Absolutely.
In terms of how do I actually. All of it's fascinating, and all of it is worth listening to. But it's also, how do I use this?
But it changes over time. It's the early 1970s. It's seen as an American tragedy. By the time you get to the Reagan administration, it's seen as a noble cause. By the time you get to the early 2000s, it's seen as a warning sign for places like Iraq and Afghanistan. So just the collective memory of Vietnam, I think, has changed over time as new history has unfolded.
Okay. I got to ask you the question about masculinity, just as sort of wrapping up here, because masculinity and war is something that part of me is sitting here thinking, well, isn't war always a masculinity crisis? Isn't like that just, we're seeing it again, right? We're seeing right now, the sort of ways that people are talking about Ukraine. I have stories in Ventura here, in the local paper this morning about veterans and others here who are gearing up and volunteering to head over to Ukraine and fight in the streets. And these guys are interviewed, and they don't sound like reactionaries, but they sound like, well, this is, people are in trouble and it's time for us to go serve, and there's a real kind of gung ho attitude about it. And it's to me, part of me is thinking, well, this is always just an entryway for a certain kind of engagement with masculinity or gender, etc. The other part of me was thinking about, you mentioned LBJ, how much of the how much of his war kind of attitude is about winning and victory and not giving up, and all that John Wayne shit.
Yeah, it is. And Robert Dean wrote a book called Imperial Brotherhood and talks about just these conceptions of Cold War masculinity and how it had an impact on words like credibility and honor, and how policymaking elite who grew up in the Cold War era and believe that, in World War II, Cold War era, who kind of believe this idea that masculinity was also defined by men being protectors, not just of the nation, but obviously of women and children of the nation.
Yeah, right.
And so these ideas, I think, of honor and courage and
family, even
and family, get wrapped up, I think, into not just definitions of masculinity, but also definitions of militarized masculinity. And so, I think you could probably find some very distinct parallels between the language that you're seeing right now, volunteers going to Ukraine, and those who were volunteering to go off to fight in the Spanish-American War in Cuba, or the Philippines, and this idea that they were going to protect young women from the savagery of Spanish forces in Cuba.
That's interesting, because that's kind of a contradiction a little bit. I wonder if you think of it as a contradiction, because there's a great moment in Hearts and Minds, in that documentary Hearts and Minds, where Daniel Ellsberg, who from the Rand Corporation, this guy who's like deeply embedded in the military-industrial complex, and he says, like, we thought of Vietnam not as like going off and punishing the savages, but we thought of it as like a progressive, liberal vision of delivering democracy. Protect it. Protecting people and delivering democracy. In other words, I feel like Daniel Ellsberg, a chief architect of the Vietnam War, or at least part of that, would look at these Cold War era adventure magazines and be disgusted and like, oh, this is not what we're doing at all. You know what I mean? Like, the contradiction is interesting because
but I think he also would get it too, right? That's in the sense of that was the era he grew up in, and probably one of the reasons I can't speak for him, but my sense is
get him on the phone. Get Ellsberg on the phone. Yeah.
What was in the magazines might have very much influenced his decision to join the Marine Corps.
Yeah,
because he was in the Marine Corps first. So.
Yeah. I mean, reading his memoir, I mean, his whole sort of spiritual revelation that came was actually listening to a veteran describing sort of believing in the cause. I think it was he was watching a veteran speak about the Vietnam War, and the person was saying how much they believed in it, and kind of repeating what Ellsberg says in Hearts and Minds, that there was a progressive, positive vision of what we were doing. And when I realized what we were actually doing was more aligned with the Cold War men's magazines and those images, that's what broke me, and that's what broke Ellsberg too. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
This is really great.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Gregory Daddis. Your book is called Pulp, Vietnam, War and Gender in Cold War Men's Adventure Magazines. And I think we've only scratched the surface of what is in this book and this conversation, because there is so many ideas and so many great images. And I really recommend everyone go check it out, and all of your work on the Vietnam War. Thank you so much for joining me. It's great to finally talk with you.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. I appreciate it.
Well, okay, I think that's going to do it for today's Nostalgia Trap. I want to thank my guest, Gregory Daddis. Go check out his book, Pulp, Vietnam. Go check out the Nostalgia Trap Patreon page, patreon.com/Nostalgia Trap. New column by Justin Rogers Cooper called In the Trap. We've got bonus episodes, live streams, lots of stuff for our subscribers, and I thank everyone that's a part of our little network. We'll talk to you again very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.